If you're an avid reader of the New York Times or closely follow geopolitical trends, you might already know the name, Nicholas Kristof. A two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of multiple books, Nicholas has spent the last 40 years with the New York Times exposing global injustices and writing about situations that many people find uncomfortable to even discuss. But what some people may not know is that Nicholas grew up in Yamhill, Oregon, on a sheep and cherry farm just a few miles away from Newberg. In this episode, I'm honored to sit down with Nicholas to discuss his incredible journey, from his upbringing in rural Oregon, where he began his writing career, to his early reporting on pivotal events like the Tiananmen Square massacre, where he faced some extremely difficult ethical decisions. Nicholas also shares stories from many of his other assignments. He explains what led him to run for Oregon governor in the 2022 election, and he shares what drives him to risk his life in some of the world's most dangerous situations. We'll also discuss his new book, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, and why maintaining hope is so crucial despite the many horrors we see globally. Hi, I'm Daniel Roberts, host of the Giving Town podcast, where we share stories about the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. This podcast is brought to you by my real estate team, the Joyful Roberts Group, where we help your family make the right move. We love serving this town and our amazing clients, and we'd be happy to assist you with buying or selling a home anywhere around the Newberg area. So if you're interested, you can learn more about us at thejoyfulrobertsgroup.com. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Nicholas Kristof about Chasing Hope. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to hearing your story. I know I had heard it a while back at the City Club, and then you have your book, Chasing Hope. But look forward to sharing that story with our listeners today.
Great to be with you.
So the first thing I want to talk about is you grew up just outside of Newberg in Yamhill. You went
out in the sticks.
Out in the sticks. And you went on to do quite a bit, which we'll get to. And anyone who knows you know that you have quite the resume. But it's always so interesting to me when we have people so close to home. We tend to think, oh, everyone who does anything that's great comes from, somewhere outside of our hometown area. So it's just so interesting. Yamhill is, in many people's minds, maybe the last place someone would think about, for someone to come out of and do some of the things that you've done. So I just think that's really cool. So one, what was it like growing up in Yamhill, and what are your thoughts on kind of what I should do?
So growing up, Yamhill was it was a place that had really improved a great deal over the years. It's a working class town. There wasn't, I'd say, a huge commitment to higher education or even to getting people through high school, but there were good mill jobs available. There were good factory jobs available at that point. There wasn't a huge gap in incomes. This was before drugs, so there was a certain amount of alcohol, but in general, it was a remarkably stable community where we all kind of prided ourselves on looking out after each other, and we kids spent our time in the hills looking for Bigfoot. We never quite got him.
So, what was your experience like growing up in Yamhill and kind of beyond? Like, how did growing up in Yamhill lead to getting into writing and journalism and beyond? So,
I think there's some real advantages to going to a small town school, grade school and high school. Later, I encountered a lot of folks who'd gone to elite boarding schools, and, there's certainly some advantages to that. But, in Yamhill, for example, I ran cross country, even though I'm not a great runner. And if I were going to a really big school, I don't think I would have had that chance. But I run every day. I ran this morning, and that is a legacy of having been in a small school and having my history teacher, John Turner, kind of coerce me onto the cross country team. I did FFA. It became a very important part of my school experience. I think it's an amazing youth organization. And again, I would not have had the chance elsewhere. My journalism career began in the 8th grade when a bunch of kids wanted to have a school newspaper, but nobody wanted the burden of editing it. And so I didn't even go to the organizational meeting, but they chose me as editor and absentia. And my journalism career was born.
So was writing in school, was that just always kind of easy for you, or is that something you had to work pretty hard for?
Oh, I'd say reading and writing were what I was good at. And, we all, I think, recognized, my friends and I, that I had an advantage in reading and writing, and they had an advantage in fixing carburetors, but it wasn't really clear which was going to be a more useful skill. And like September's picking strawberries. I was a terrible strawberry picker. But it just so happened that in the decades since, the returns for being a good strawberry picker or being good at fixing carburetors kind of collapsed, and the returns on being a good reader and writer soared. And that was not apparent in the 1970s. And it really reflects changes in the economy.
You went on to also get quite a few awards and accolades, and even including the Rhodes Scholarship. Can you share what that was like?
So, in a sense, normally if you win one lottery, you're not more likely to win another, but that is not true of academic awards and maybe in life itself. So, I was very lucky to be accepted by Harvard. I'd never been to the Harvard campus. I'd, kind of applied out of the blue, had no idea. But, they wanted an occasional farm kid from the rural Oregon. And so they accepted me. Then once they had accepted me, then it became much more likely that I would win that Rhodes Scholarship. Once I had won the Rhodes Scholarship, it was more likely that the Washington Post was going to hire me as an intern, which made it much more likely that the New York Times would hire me as a reporter. And so in so many ways, it feels to me as if my career was a matter of, one little bit of luck that then fed on and created more opportunities down the road. And, and that was true of the Rhodes Scholarship. And, look, obviously I worked really hard. I was great at school and all that. But, there are a lot of people who are smart and work hard and do well. And I won the lottery not once, but many times over.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I've never thought of it quite that way. So going from back to 8th grade, you kind of get elected without realizing it to be the editor of the newspaper. But you went on to do a lot more than just be a journalist. Like, you got very involved, and we'll talk in a little bit about some of the ways that you maybe got involved in ways that maybe your team back home might not have seen as appropriate. But you had a heart to do the right thing. What do you think led to that?
Well, since we're back in the 8th grade at Yamhill grade school, I should say that one of the secrets was that, look, what does every 8th grade boy want to do? You want to impress 8th grade girls. And it so happened that Yamhill grade school had a school dress policy that did not allow girls to wear blue jeans. Boys could wear blue jeans, girls couldn't. Girls were, of course, very indignant at this. And so I wrote a very sarcastic editorial, commending our principal on his brilliance in understanding that the denim and blue dye and female flesh somehow conspired to create this very volatile situation. And look, the girls were thrilled, and it worked. They ended that ban on blue jeans for girls, and I felt this power of journalism. I felt like I had something, a great in with 8th grade girls, and had, helped defeat the patriarchy. And so that was one small step into the journalism world in particular. And then, I think later on, I just saw a lot of, as a journalist, I was witness to a lot of massacres, a lot of wars, a lot of people dying unnecessarily. Later, I saw that in Yamhill among people who I cared deeply about. And when you see things go south in that way, you want to fight back. You want to do what you can. And in my case, I fight back with my keyboard and my camera.
So going from fighting for the rights and fighting the patriarchy before fighting the patriarchy was maybe cool in some ways. And, I think people can read your biography and kind of see every step of the progression of how, we don't have a ton of time. Otherwise we'd get into all of that. But long story short, right? You went from, 8th grade through high school, was working on papers. You worked on a paper at Harvard, if I remember, Oxford too. Right?
At Harvard, yeah.
Okay.
And then the Wash Post hired me, and then the New York Times.
Okay. So through all of that, you're gaining journalistic experience. You're being seen, hey, Nicholas is actually really good at what he does. At what point do you feel like there was a turn from, hey, I'm writing, this is a great career. Like, how did you envision your career going compared to what actually happened? Did you always envision yourself doing what you did, or did that change at some point?
So, I did study law. I was in danger of becoming a lawyer for a while, but, I loved the journalism. When the Times hired me, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and the New York Times sent me to Asia as a foreign correspondent. I was the Beijing bureau chief, and covered the Tiananmen Square democracy movement and the massacre that ended it. And that was both searing to witness, and incredibly frustrating, but also it did feel truly important to be able to bear witness to a terrible crime and document it and raise the cost of committing crimes like that. And so that, that was what I decided I wanted to do more of.
So the Tiananmen Square incident was really your first exposure to...
seeing, a modern army use weapons of war against people because they want democracy. And you just don't forget that. And, I was in the crowd that they opened fire on. People around me were being shot. It was both terrifying and, as a reporter, exhilarating in the sense that this is what you want to do. You want to document things and be there. And, that it was. And I think that fed my resolve to try to cover other kinds of crises and try to bring some, it sounds a little pretentious to say so, but some sort of moral element to journalism, that we have an extraordinary platform and that we shouldn't just use that to create more quarterly profits for our employer, but to try to advance the public good, to try to bring some kind of greater understanding, to try to heal the country's wounds to some extent. And so imperfectly, that's what I labor to do.
The Tiananmen Square incident, many people in my generation have heard of it, but don't really know. They know, okay, it's something where the Chinese army shot a bunch of people, but what surrounded that and why that happened, I think a lot of people, it's coming up on being older history, in this instance where people know it. But you were actually there. You were there before it happened. Can you share a little bit of the context as to what was happening and your involvement and kind of how that all went down while you were there?
So in the spring of 1989, university students began to lead a democracy movement, demand greater democracy in China. And I look back and I'm a little embarrassed that I was, I think, somewhat condescending to some of the workers and peasants who were protesting. And I wrote that, they say they're for democracy, but they can't define the kind of democracy that they're for. They can't describe the institutions that they would create. And that was all true. But that terrible night when the army invaded Beijing and began massacring people, the bravest people that night, Daniel, were these workers and uneducated peasants. And, on one road coming in, the old airport road, there was a convoy of trucks carrying soldiers, going in toward the center to attack the students. And a bus driver, salt of the earth, not very educated bus driver, saw the convoy of trucks coming, and he, used his bus to block the road so they couldn't pass. And he turned the engine off. He had the key in his hand. He stepped out, and an officer in the lead truck came over to him and said, "Move the bus." And the bus driver said no. And the officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver and said, "Move the bus." And at that, the bus driver, he had the key in his hand. He just hurled the bus keys into the grassy verd, high grass beside the road. It was night. They weren't going to find that. And, maybe that guy couldn't define democracy, but he was willing to die for it. And I thought so often that we in this country have inherited democracy and perhaps as a result don't appreciate it as fully as those Chinese I saw who risked their lives and in some cases actually died to try to obtain what we have and take for granted.
It's a heavy topic too, because we didn't get the happy ending that we would have liked to get, where everyone protests and, overcomes the evil regime and gets democracy, but they were massacred. There's still communism in China, and it's not even, from my understanding, it's not even allowed to be talked about. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's gotten harsher in recent years. I can no longer get a journalist visa to China because of my reporting, and it's I've had many friends arrested, imprisoned, and it is one of the things. I mean, I've covered other kinds of crises and massacres like this, and one of the things you learn is that when people with principles go up against soldiers with machine guns in the short run, it's the guys with the machine guns who usually win. Now, I do think in the long run that aspirations for democracy, for autonomy, will triumph. And at some point, I think there will be a monument in Tiananmen Square to those incredibly brave people, like that bus driver. But that's the long run. And I have no idea what the timetable will be.
Yeah. So from there, where you were in the crowd, you were getting shot at, trying to duck behind, trying to make sure you're actually able to get out and get your story out. What was going through your mind at that point?
I remember so when the troops began to open fire on the crowds, I lived about 3 miles from Tiananmen Square, and the roads had been closed by the protesters to block tanks from getting in. So I took my bicycle and bicycled frantically toward the gunfire. And there were these vast throngs all running in the other direction away from the gunfire. And I remember being hunched over my bicycle and just thinking, what a crazy job this is. That when anybody with any bit of sanity is running away from gunfire, I'm running toward it.
What do you think inside you made you run toward it instead of run away with everyone else?
I wanted to document it. I really did. And again, I had covered the protests. I thought that these incredibly brave students had what they were pursuing would be good for China, would be good for the world. And the fact that they were now being massacred for their beliefs, for peaceful protests, that is something that I wanted to fight back. And I can only fight back if I am on the scene and can witness it and can interview people and can record it for history.
Yeah. So what was the breakdown after this? Like, how did that, maybe a better term is like, for you, what was the fallout of that and being there?
So, many of my friends were imprisoned or fled the country. Foreigners swarmed out of the country. My wife's poor parents were trying desperately to get us to leave. And I was trying to explain that, no, if you're a reporter, this is actually where you have to be. And I think the most intensely difficult personal decision I had to make involved a young man who had helped us cover the Tiananmen democracy movement. And because he had helped us cover it, he was imprisoned. He escaped from prison, and then he came to Beijing and he met me secretly and asked for help fleeing China. And the one pretty basic rule of being a foreign correspondent is you don't help escaped felons flee the country. You're there to obey the law. You have an obligation to obey the law. If we were caught, helping him, we would be in prison. The New York Times bureau would have been closed down. I might have been fired. And yet here's a 19-year-old guy who was in trouble only because he had helped me and because he'd helped New York Times readers. I had won a Pulitzer Prize because, in part, of the help that he and others provided. And how could I let him just hang out to dry? And so I was agonizing over my responsibilities to him, to the New York Times, to my readers. I also wondered, I'd never heard of anybody escaping from a Chinese prison before. Was that real, or was that some attempt to entrap me, to film me helping him and then arrest me as a way of kicking me out of the country? And that was the hardest ethical decision I've ever had to make. But in the end, my wife and I did help him. And he was able to escape to Hong Kong. And then I flew to Hong Kong the next day, and we were able to get him to the U.S. And he's now an American citizen. It's the most unprofessional thing I've ever done, but also one that I'm truly proudest of.
Yeah. Wow, I imagine that would have been one of those things that if you don't do it, it haunts you, right? That how can you?
He would have been caught at some point.
Yeah.
And then terrible things would have happened.
Yeah.
But it could have gone the other way. It could have been an effort to entrap me. I could have been, I could have been arrested. The Times Bureau closed, my journalism career over. It was, it was a really, and of course I couldn't ask my editor, I couldn't consult with my editors, partly because our phone lines were tapped, but also, in any case, no editor can say, yeah, you should go ahead and violate Chinese law. That's just not going to be one of the options.
So you've always had a bit of a rogue spirit in you, it seems, even from 8th grade, probably before. I'm sure your parents, when you were I have a 3.5-year-old, and I'm, at that age, it's like, oh my gosh, can you just say yes every once in a while instead of just no? But in the end, if you have a moral compass and are stubborn to do the right thing, I think that hard spirit. So this is maybe off topic, but it makes me wonder, were you a strong-willed child who just said like, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, or were you more compliant?
I don't think that I was so difficult a child, although I do think that the principal at the time at Yamhill Carleton High School might have disagreed. But I do think part of what was behind this was my dad was a refugee in World War II, and his life was saved by a French diplomat who kind of broke the rules to save his life. And then to get an American visa, there were 2 French journalists who intervened with the American ambassador and suggested he give my dad a visa. And again, journalists shouldn't really be asking ambassadors for favors like that, but they did, and as a result, I exist. And so, while I'm very conscious of ethical boundaries, and I don't do anything lightly, I also understand that it feels like I have some moral obligation to pay it forward where I can. But then go public and explain what I did and the difficult choice that I made. And that's why I wrote about it in Chasing Hope, wrote about helping this guy escape China, wrote about some other, really difficult ethical decisions that I had to make along the way.
Do you see yourself as, you mentioned having, as a journalist, it's not just increasing the bottom line for for the publisher in having it be a career, but you see it as a moral obligation. Is this something that you feel like other journalists should embrace? I mean, it's a hard thing because there's so much discretion you have to have in some of these situations of, you can't just have a blanket rule of, oh, well, yes, if you're in this situation,
right,
you have to.
So, I think it's basically the answer is yes. I think that we should have values. We should have some sense that we are connecting to a cause larger than ourselves, larger than the profits of our news organization. But you can't cover every city council meeting as if, this is some great moral issue where you were taking sides and you accumulate political capital by being fair and by being neutral. And so how you navigate that is, I think, really difficult. And, but I do think we have to be conscious of fundamentally having values, being transparent about them, and trying to, as best we can, serve the public interest, with a caveat that it is often really hard to figure out how to, what that is and how to navigate that, and people will disagree.
Yeah. So going back to, I know we keep jumping around a bit, but there is a path. Coming back to Tiananmen Square. So after that, you come back to the United States. How do you come back to normal life after experiencing something like that? I mean, it's just, imagine that must have been, I don't know if you had to go through like drama counseling or just it's a shock to come from such an intense situation to back in the United States where it's like it never happened, right?
So in writing Chasing Hope, I kind of realized that I had suffered a certain amount of PTSD from covering not just Tiananmen, but then the Iraq and Afghan wars, covered the Darfur genocide.
So it wasn't until writing the book that you realized that you had
some PTSD. Okay. Yeah, I sort of self-diagnosed myself. And then I realized that in that same period, I had been backpacking very energetically in the mountains. My daughter and I backpacked the whole Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. And I think that was a certain amount of self-prescribed wilderness therapy to deal with this unconscious PTSD. But I do think that was part of it. I also think that coming back to the farm here in Yamhill, the farm that I grew up on, was part of that healing. There is something about, just being on this farm, and in my day job as a columnist for the New York Times, I shout at the world and tell it what to do, and it pays no attention whatsoever. But on the farm, if I've got an apple tree that needs water, I can pour a bucket of water on it, and it listens to me. It responds. And there is something very cathartic about that.
But coming back to you're still a journalist for the New York Times, in which you've been for this year is 40 years, right?
Yeah, for 40 years since I joined the Times. Yeah.
Which, congratulations on that, by the way. That's I think quite an achievement to be at the same organization, and I'm sure you've learned quite a few things over those 40 years. But coming back, so this is in 89, right? So you come back, and then what does it look like? I mean, obviously there's that adventurous spirit to I need to make a difference, democracy and justice. So what are the next? I mean, you mentioned Darfur, the Middle East, and other things that you went and did, right?
Yeah. So we in the 1990s, we spent much of 1990s in Asia, based in Asia with the Times. Then I was editor of the Sunday New York Times, based in New York, and then was made a columnist after 9/11. And essentially, the Times decided it wanted somebody to cover the world, and so that was when I began spending a lot of time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then I would come back to the farm to heal, and I saw a humanitarian crisis unfolding there, and that's partly because my end of Yamhill is around a little hamlet of Cove Orchard between Yamhill and Gaston. And it's an area that has struggled. It was the first area in the county, as far as I know, where meth was cooked by actually one of my classmates. So at this point, more than a third of the kids on my old school bus have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
So this is in the 2000s, you're saying?
It began in the 1990s.
Okay.
It began essentially when good jobs went away, and then meth arrived, and people self-medicated.
So you said that the bus that you grew up on, going to school with, over a third
of the kids on my old school bus have died from drugs, alcohol, and suicide, what are called deaths of despair. And so, the 5 kids who got on the school bus right after me, each day, the eldest, Farland, was in my class, and he was the one who really introduced meth to the area, first began cooking meth. And, very smart, talented guy. He would have made a great pharmacist, given more training. Instead, he ended up cooking meth. He died of liver failure from drug and alcohol abuse. His brother, Zeelan, died in a house fire when he was passed out drunk. His brother, Nathan, blew himself up cooking meth. His sister, Regina, died of hepatitis from IV drug use. And their baby brother, Keelan, was in the Oregon State Penitentiary for 13 years, and that had seemed to save his life, but then he was released in the beginning of or a little before the pandemic, and died of an overdose at the beginning of the pandemic. And so 5 kids, smart, talented kids, gone one after the other. And meanwhile, their mom is still alive in her 80s, climbing up the hill every day to visit the graves of her 5 dead kids. And this was a tragedy not only in what my friends suffered, but frankly, they also inflicted great suffering on others. And one of the things that I saw really clearly was that hurt people hurt others. And I look back and I think, where were the grown-ups in the 1970s if they didn't send these kids through school to get a high school diploma, to push them to join the military and get a skill, to go to community college, to get some kind of a lasting skill that might have made a difference. And instead, as a country, we were okay with losing good jobs and not providing those, looking out for those who were lost in that. And, look, I'm very much a liberal, but in Oregon, I look around and I do think we failed the working class. And we had the timber wars in this state, and I'm on the winning side of the timber wars. I do think that logging was going on at an unsustainable pace in the 1970s and 80s, that there had to be restrictions. But in retrospect, I think we showed more compassion for spotted owls than we did for logging families. And we could have worked, I think, much harder to try to support these communities, to retrain them, to find some better way to make sure kids get through school, get an education. And I think we failed a lot of these kids before they failed us, and they made bad choices. We made bad choices as a society as well, and we have to look both at personal responsibility, but also at our collective irresponsibility in policies that didn't do enough to try to help these kids.
So what was your, not solution, because there is no this easy solution, but, you came back and you saw this happening. What did that do, to you? Obviously, you're like, okay, I need to find some way to make a difference. So, what was your next step?
So I ran for governor, which basically I was just very frustrated at the state of the state. And, I think it's hard to walk through Portland and see it as a triumph of good governance. And, this is not true just of Oregon. I tend to think, just of Portland, I tend to think that education is the best metric for where a society will be in 25 years. And Oregon's K-12 outcomes now are worse than Mississippi's. This is not a good look for a state, for our future as a state. And, there are too many folks who were going homeless, who weren't getting drug treatment. I just thought that we had a lot of failures. I thought the field running for governor was weak, and I thought that if a reformist were elected, that person would really have a mandate to try to do new things and also to, try to chip away at the urban-rural divide, which I straddle and care a lot about. But that was not to be. The Secretary of State, Shemia Fagan, tossed me off the ballot, said I didn't qualify, said I didn't meet the residency requirement. She was.
Is that because you were gone too much?
So she said, she noted my many ties to New York, which was entirely true. I mean, we'd also had a house in New York. We'd sent our kids to school in New York. We also had a house. We built a wing on our house here at the beginning of 1994. We spent the summers here. I mean, basically, from my point of view, I was a dual resident both of New York and of Oregon. She would argue that no, on balance, I was a resident of just of New York. I would argue that she was, that she saw that I was leading in the polls and had the most campaign donors and, didn't, and she was supporting someone else. I'm sure she would disagree.
Amazing how much politics is in politics.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, this is my perspective and I'm not, sure. I'm rather biased. Of course, she was forced to resign in a corruption scandal. And so, but that was
some journalistic evidence maybe to suggest. I'm sure that must have been really frustrating though. You have this heart and
I remember, the day, that we were pushed out, of the governor's race, and I gave a press conference downtown and had to pass various homeless folks there. And I remember thinking, I'm going to be just fine. My campaign staff is going to be just fine. My phone was already lighting up with texts from people wanting me to do this or that. I'm going to be just fine. But these folks who don't have a place to live, that's the challenge. And I just hope that we can try to heal some of these divides in the state, get more housing built, work on education, try to deal with the addiction crisis in most of the country. Deaths from overdoses are now declining. They've gone down from about 107,000 to an annual pace just under 100,000 in Oregon. And in most of the West Coast, they're still increasing. We have I think one of my frustrations, is that I think in Oregon, we tend to think of our problems as unique, but in many ways, the problems of Seattle are parallel to those of Portland, are parallel to those of San Francisco, to some degree parallel to those of Los Angeles. I think Los Angeles may be turning a corner. And I think that points to some of these larger challenges that we've got to address together. And, I would put housing and addiction and education at the, very high up on that. And so, look, I can't tackle that as governor, but I can as a columnist. And, I try to write about these issues quite regularly.
And there's sometimes a fine line between politics and humanitarian efforts. And this podcast is about sharing the good stories of hope and generosity. And at the same time, I think everyone wants the same thing, whichever side. I'd like to think that anyway. Totally. Who have good hearts. I know people with good hearts on both sides.
Absolutely.
Come at things from opposite perspectives. And one thing that I really wish is that this I know we're coming right before an election, so maybe this is totally going off of what I normally like talking about, but there's such a need to work, like civility and working together and not getting so hung up on. I was just reading a report, like people will change their voting based on, like, they did these studies saying like, oh, this party wants to do this, and people would vote for it, which is the complete opposite of what's actually true. And they were like these tests that like people will vote completely opposite of what they actually believe in just because of the, like, that's what their party says, so it must be right, which is why it's very difficult to align with any one party.
I mean, I think we have to learn how to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And I'm, distressed by the number of people who say that they can't go home for Thanksgiving because they can't face family members, loved ones. And boy, we have to be willing to love people even as we disagree with them. In rural Yamhill, I have so many friends who utterly disagree with me on every possible issue. And they're good people, and I think they're misled, and they think I'm misled, but we care about each other. We do talk about politics sometimes, and, neither of us persuades the other, but we have to figure out how to lower the temperature and have respect for people, even if we think they're profoundly misguided.
I want to spend at least a little bit of time talking, because you shared a little while back at the City Club about, I'm trying to remember which country it was in, where basically you came in, because there's a few other things I want to talk about, but the times that you came, like, you go in, basically you break the rules to go and do the right thing, and I don't want to give it away without talking about it, but basically you had to pretend that you flew out, right?
Oh, that was Sudan. That was Darfur, the Darfur genocide. Yeah, they were busy committing a genocide in Darfur.
That's one way of putting it.
Yeah, and so of course they wouldn't give me a visa to cover the genocide, and so the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, he agreed to take me in on his plane. He was making a brief stopover, and so as we were coming down, I went over to him and said, Kofi, just want you to know that I'm going to miss the plane out. And so don't, if I don't board the plane after a couple of hours, don't worry about it. And he just said, just be careful. And so sure enough, I, intentionally missed the plane out. And so there I was in the heart of this genocide. The authorities didn't know that I was there. They assumed that I had left. And so I was able to cover what was going on. I was able to get that access to, fight back with my keyboard. And that's...
Now, what year was this?
This would have been probably around 2007.
Okay. And with the genocide there, what was the context of what was happening there?
So there was tension between Arab and non-Arab tribes in this Darfur region, and the government sided with the Arab tribes and empowered them, gave them weapons and support, and they went around massacring the non-Arab tribes and massacring the men, raping the women, burning villages.
And so back to, you came in, we're covering this, and how did you get out? Well, maybe first share that, and maybe there's not a whole lot of great to share other than these tragedies or atrocities are happening.
Well, that was a case where I think the collective efforts of journalists and aid workers saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And there were still hundreds of thousands who were killed and massacred, and vast numbers who were raped and so on. But there was enough outrage internationally that President Bush, Colin Powell, did press Sudan and then press China, which was providing weapons to Sudan. And that had a real impact. They burned fewer villages. They raped fewer women. They massacred fewer men and boys. And so it was a reminder that even when terrible things are happening halfway around the world in places that we don't have good access to, simply the process of shining a light on it, making people spill their coffee when they read the paper, that it can have a real effect, imperfectly.
So in a lot of ways, if you hadn't been there covering some of these things, people never would have even known. It just would have been happening in the dark. So do you feel like, so you're writing some of these pieces, you're publishing them, they're getting read. I imagine that must feel, at least as hard as that is, rewarding to know, like, hey, I'm making a difference, and this is helping the efforts to stop some of this.
I'm just so lucky that I have this New York Times platform, and that, the president reads me. One time I was in Newberg shopping, and President Biden called me up about a piece that I had written that day. I do have this incredible platform, not something that I earned particularly, but because it's the New York Times and because it's very closely read in the White House, in Congress. And with that comes this responsibility to use that platform, to use this incredibly valuable real estate. We're both in the real estate business, different kinds. To use my real estate on the, in the Times to not, stir up feuds but to try to solve problems that are all around us.
Which I really appreciate on a personal level. I'm a firm believer in the saying, to whom much is given, much is required. And I live my life as much as I can by that. And I feel like there's always more I can be doing, and you have to not get too much in your own head of like, I could do what you can without getting too stressed out about it. But I really appreciate your approach, because so many people are focused on what gets the clicks, what gets the headlines in. And I think a lot of Americans, to be honest, just my perspective is many Americans don't have the stomach for heavy, important topics. They want to see the latest celebrity gossip, the thing that they can read on and either feel good about or go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that, and keep going on with their day. But when you confront people with, hey, you need to challenge yourself, or you like, hey, you could do something about this. Like it's hard. Like we want to just turn a blind eye a lot of times. And I don't know if you experienced that. I mean, you mentioned like shouting to the world and no one listens. Whereas, and I sometimes feel the same thing with with the podcast of, there's so many amazing stories that I want everyone to listen to, but people have their own priorities, and just
absolutely,
I think someone should care doesn't mean they do. Do you struggle with that at all?
Oh,
I know you have a big platform, but
I worry about. I'm just actually back from a trip to the Sudan-Chad border, and I've been to the Middle East twice in the last year since October 7th, since the war started. And, I think about my family, and the book Chasing Hope, I began with a plane crash that I was in Congo. That's pretty hard on my wife when these things happen. It's sort of a family joke that I go out the door and promise I'm going to be careful. Terrible things happen, and I sort of walk in shamefacedly. But it is somewhat unfair to put my wife and kids through this. On the other hand, I care very deeply about these stories, and balancing that is difficult. And, calling attention to issues, there are a lot of people who are completely outraged by what I write, and of course that's their right. But I wrote early this year about a friend of mine whom I grew up with, who I wrote that he was a good kid, and yet the fundamental conundrum was that one day when he was high on meth and drunk in Lincoln City, he brutally beat a young woman shopkeeper. He was lucky he didn't kill her. He was sentenced to prison for 20 years. And so my article was trying to explore how a good man could have done such a awful, awful thing. And to me, it's an enormous contradiction that goes to a lot of the complexities in our society. But I think a lot of readers were really outraged at that piece and saw me as whitewashing a brutal criminal who had, ruined this woman's life. And it's, and that's a legit, there is something to that. It's complicated, but trying to present that complexity to people, and embrace complexity, that can be a challenge at a time when we're all so polarized.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because that's exactly, I think the one thing that makes me emotional more than a lot of other things is, like when you look at what a kid goes through in their life, and, most people don't grow up and say, I think I'm going to get addicted to drugs today and go down this path, yada, yada, yada. But when you look at like, how were they physically, emotionally, many times sexually abused as kids, many times their parents introduced them to drugs. They were often traumatized in so many ways. And not that there's not the responsibility, it's complex, but I think as people, we have to recognize there's a responsibility, and to just label someone as a bad person is not fair. Like, I think of like myself, I'm incredibly fortunate. You're incredibly fortunate in your case that you had parents who cared about you and treated you well. And I have to look at people I know who, and many people overcame great odds, but recognizing I'm no different. I'm not special. If I had gone through some of those things, that could have been me. And I think it takes the humility, and I wish more people would be willing to embrace the humility of recognizing you don't know that wouldn't be you if you had been in their shoes.
Totally.
And yeah, so totally. I totally get what you're saying.
I think it's very easy for people who've been successful to look in the mirror and say, you worked hard, you obeyed the law, you did everything right, you deserve all this. And that is true. But the most important choice we make isn't to work hard, to study hard, etc. It's the choice of the parents we have. And, so much of our outcomes is based on just the lottery of birth. And I was so lucky that I had parents who hugged me, who read to me, who, were confident that I would go to college, who believed in me. And that was not true. My friend, Farland, who would introduce meth to the area, he grew up with a very, very violent father. And Farland's main aspiration when we were kids was he wanted to kill his father. And what does that do to a kid? That just burned him. Yeah. Every day his dad was brutally beating his mom, brutally beating the kids. And Farland then made terrible choices. And he hurt a lot of people. And there are probably people who died of addiction because of him, as well as his own death. His daughter then died at 29. She drank herself to death. And that's, that's all real, but it came out of a context. And I wish that we had done more to try to support these kids when they were young. And some of them, at least, we might have been able to turn in a different direction.
Which comes back to, you ultimately decided to write, and you wrote other books, but the one we're talking about now is Chasing Hope, despite all these things where it's like, many people could look at all this and say it's a hopeless situation. Look at what we've done to ourselves, look where we're at. But you still, after experiencing all these tragedies and atrocities, say, there is reason to hope, and you're chasing it.
Totally.
What led to actually writing, not just for the Times, but saying, hey, I actually want to compile this into a book?
Well, partly, frankly, it is that I see so many people who've kind of given up, and especially young people, and they think, look, with home prices, I'm never going to be able to afford to buy a house. Meanwhile, climate change is cooking our planet. I can't find a partner. It's impossible for guys and girls to find each other these days. That I can't afford the things that I want in life, and democracy is under threat. These grievances are real. The threats, the challenges are all real. But in my career, I've seen us overcome enormous problems in the past. And what I'm advocating isn't hope as this kind of blind, complacent confidence that somehow things will work out, but hope is a kind of a muscle, a sense of what is possible if you put your shoulder to the wheel. And I think that if one does have that kind of, then it becomes empowering, and you're not sure that you can solve these problems, but you think you've got a fighting chance. And with that, you make progress, imperfect progress, but progress. And so that's what I hope readers will take away from Chase and Toby, that they may chase hope as well.
Obviously, we don't have time to go through the whole book. We've shared some stories. What are the main takeaways? So say someone picks up the book, and maybe I'll let you share the ideal scenario of someone who kind of is in that hopeless state, and they pick up the book. What do you hope happens to the reader as they go through the book?
Well, I hope they find it a page turner. In other words, I write. I'm a storyteller, and so I wrote this not as this kind of didactic, finger wagging, thing that where readers should feel like it's finished, but it really is meant to be a good yarn about some amazing adventures, about the challenges that we as a country and as a world face, but I hope in a way that is, frankly, kind of entertaining and keeps people going. And I hope it does ignite that spark of hope at the end and does leave people feeling empowered that, yes, the challenges are real, but we can come together and solve. Solve is a big word, but make real progress against them. It was a little hard when I was running for governor. It was the natural impulse as a politician is to say, we're going to solve homelessness. We're going to solve this. And, in the real world, what you do is you chip away at problems and make real progress that benefits people. But it's not as if every problem is going to go away. Yeah. And it was a little bit hard to convey that nuance. But I fundamentally think that's what happens. And, it is encouraging that right now we've seen mortality from addiction decline for the first time in 20 years. We've seen teen births drop by 60% since the modern peak in 1991. We have seen some real progress on important issues. Homelessness was for veterans was a huge national problem, and Obama made a big push against it. We reduced veteran homelessness by more than 50%. That wasn't enough. But boy, if you're one of those veterans who was out in the street, that's real. And so I'd like to leave people with this measured sense that we can tackle the problems, and that we'll all be better off if we do that.
Nicholas, I really appreciate your time. I've appreciated our conversation. I can't believe we're already almost at an hour. In some ways, you've already answered it. But I want to ask directly, like I ask everyone who comes on, is, for our area, for Newberg, and I'll expand that out into Yamhill County and your hometown of Yamhill, where you are now. What gives you hope for the future of our area?
So I think it's that we are incredibly lucky in Yamhill County to have this phenomenally beautiful setting. And it's one that climate change will cause all kinds of problems in much of the country. The Willamette Valley, and particularly this end of it, is actually one that will be relatively less affected than almost anywhere else in the nation. And I think that will be a boon for the next few decades. And I talked about some of these problems that we face, but I've also seen real problems. in Portland used to be a model of urban planning. The Atlantic magazine in 1992 had a cover story about Portland called, what was it called? Like, how does Portland do it? And what Yamhill County has done in terms of the wine industry creating jobs. When I was a kid and we saw sawmills closing and factories closing, we would never have imagined that this new industry would have emerged and create good jobs. And, unfortunately, a lot of the families who had been supported by the mills haven't found new jobs in the wineries, and we've got to do a better job at the ad. We've got to do a better job in education. Newberg has a real crisis in education right now. But we are problem solvers. People first came to Oregon in the 1840s from the East. The pioneers came to Oregon as problem solvers. And if they could solve those problems over 3,000 miles, then surely when we're already here, we can do a better job of solving these problems around us.
And it comes from embracing hope. And I like that you said it's like a muscle. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So I appreciate that. Well, thank you again. Thank you for the work that you've done and the stories that you've shared. It is very inspiring. And I think it helps, even though we may not travel the world, we meaning me and the listeners may not travel the world writing on these things. I think an awareness of having a mindset that you can do it, that you can make a positive change. So I'd encourage the listeners to pick up a copy of Chasing Hope, it's a Reporter's Life, right?
Yeah.
Get that title right?
That's right. And there are signed copies at the 3rd Street Bookshop in McMinnville.
Oh, okay.
So,
and if you can't make the trek, you can find it online. But great story. I haven't read the whole thing. I've seen part of it, and it is very engaging. So, but thank you. I want to say thank you for your work in writing the book and being a force for hope in our town, in our county, and in the world.
Thank you, Daniel. My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Giving Town podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think might benefit from hearing it. While more and more people are continuing to hear about this podcast, I still need your help to spread the message about all the people and organizations that make Newberg so great. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next episode.